History likes to pretend, and of Cleves was the ugly wife. But here's the thing. The woman outlived every single one of Henry VIII's other brides, retired rich, and never got her head chopped off. While Henry was busy combusting under his own ego and turkey leg grease, and was chilling in the countryside, collecting rent, wearing jewels, and vibing in peace. So yeah, maybe the real loser in this royal Tinder experiment wasn't an at all, but the man who swiped right on chaos. This is the story of the queen who won by losing. Picture the throne room like a half-finished banquet. Glittering plates, stale air, and a king who looks as if the portrait painter ran out of mercy before he ran out of gold leaf. Henry VIII is pushing 50, limping on a leg that smells like a grudge, bandaged and blistered, yet convinced he's still the opening act and the encore. His waistline has gone from jousting champion to banquet table, but the man remains serenely certain that God put England on earth so Henry could have someone to flirt with. By this moment, the royal relationship resume reads like a demolition report. Catherine of Aragon, divorced because a papal no complicated a royal no even more. And Boleyn, executed after Henry's passion curdled into politics. Jane Seymour, dead in childbed, sainted by nostalgia and the need for an heir. The fourth act must be a miracle or at least a ceasefire. The breakroom chatter at court is exhausted. The nation wants peace, not another royal wedding that ends like bad theater. But the realm's nerves aren't just marital gossip. They're survival. Europe is a table with knives for cutlery. The Reformation has turned friends into footnotes and enemies into dinner guests. Spain stares. France hovers. The Holy Roman Empire waits for the English to sneeze so they can sell them a handkerchief at sword point. Henry needs an alliance that looks good on coinage and keeps his borders quiet. Which is to say, he needs a wife, preferably one who doubles as a treaty and doesn't have opinions about policy that clash with his breakfast. Enter the idea of Anne of Cleves, not yet the woman herself, just a rumor shaped like a rescue boat. Her brother rules a strategically useful hunk of the Rhineland. Her family leans Protestant enough to annoy Henry's enemies and reassure his bankers. Courtiers pronounce Cleves with optimistic vowels, and for once the room smells like hope instead of ointment. There is, however, one small complication. The king wants to fall in love the way he falls into banquets. Eyes first, reason later. So he orders portraits. Not selfies. Oil-painted endorsements. Hans Holbein becomes the royal algorithm, dispatched to Europe to collect faces that could steady a kingdom. Henry will pick a bride the way nobles pick horses, by posture and promise, without ever mounting the reality. It is both shrewd and ridiculous, like negotiating peace through a mirror. Courtiers nod because nodding is safer than honesty, and the paint dries in rooms where the air tastes like diplomacy and linseed oil. Before any canvas returns, Henry rehearses delight. He imagines a woman who will adore him on sight, the way courtiers do when the stipends arrive. He scripts a future where mornings smell like spiced wine instead of poultice, where the king's body does not betray him and the kingdom forgets to notice when it does. This is the most dangerous phase of any Tudor plan. The part where Henry believes his own trailer. Let that sink in. Outside Whitehall, London wheezes through winter. The river is a slow bruise. Fishwives curse truthfully. Carters swear poetically. Inside, it's candles, velvet, and the scrape of quills writing futures for people who will never get to edit them. The Privy Council maps Europe on a table while the king maps fantasy on his pillow. An entire nation is balancing on the hinge between a paintbrush and a pulse. Meanwhile, courtiers rehearse their compliments. One perfect remark can purchase a year of safety. Your Grace, her virtues are peerless. Your Majesty, her lineage is an anchor. No one says the obvious. Marriages built on foreign policy require domestic patience, and Henry's patience now comes in thimble-sized servings. The king's leg throbs, his pride flares, his memory romanticizes dead wives because dead wives don't argue. Grief, mixed with power, ages into something sharp and strangely performative. And yet, credit where it's due. Henry isn't just a hungry heart, he's a cornered politician. The pilgrimage of grace rattled the north. Monasteries fell like chess pieces. Treasury men count coins the way monks once counted prayers. A bride from Cleves could glue together a coalition long enough for England to exhale. Picture the realm as a cracked window in winter, and is the promised pane of glass, and everyone hopes the draft will finally stop nagging. The king paces. Advisors hover like intelligent furniture. Ambassadors ink letters full of sugar and threat. In hallways, tapestries ripple with the gossip of people who know better than to have opinions. At night, Henry dreams a dream he's had since youth. Himself in armor, bright and lean, riding toward a future that always rides away faster. He wakes to the weight of his body and the arithmetic of his throne. One more wife, one more bet against chaos. So when Holbein eventually returns with his portfolio, the court breathes as if air had been scarce and now grows generous. The portraits unfurl like banners. Prospects reduced to posture, jewelry, and the kind of smile that is more about endurance than joy. Anne's face, composed, gentle, almost serenely uninteresting to those seeking frenzy, whispers sanity. To Henry, it shouts deliverance. He points. Courtiers congratulate his wisdom with the precision of men testing ice. And beneath the trumpets of approval, a softer drum. The simple human hope that this time the story will turn kind. That the king will treat a woman like a person instead of a solution. That a marriage might be a roof, not a battlefield. Breathe that in, dust and all. Because when Anne of Cleves finally met Henry, it did not go like the brochure promised. Truly, if you've ever had a friend who insists they've found the one, after seeing 3 photos and a quote from a dating profile, congratulations. You understand 16th century royal courtship. Except instead of swiping right, Henry VIII sent Hans Holbein, Europe's most dangerously talented matchmaker with a paintbrush, to go collect potential wives like Pokemon cards with dowries. Holbein's job description was simple. Travel Europe, paint beautiful women, don't offend anyone, and somehow make political chaos look flattering. This was the Renaissance equivalent of being sent out to make a movie trailer for a film that doesn't exist yet. He traveled with royal letters, powdered pigments, and a prayer that no duke's ego would be bruised by the lighting. When he reached the court of Cleves, Holbein was received with polite confusion. Anne and her sister Amalia were not the usual English ideals of beauty. They didn't wear plunging gowns or French-inspired curls. They were German, practical, dressed in layered modesty and sleeves you could camp in. Still, Holbein got to work. He positioned and carefully captured her kindness in the eyes, her calm poise, the type of face that says, "I'm not sure why you're shouting, but I hope you feel better soon." Back in England, the portrait arrived rolled in silk and diplomatic tension. Courtiers gathered as if a magic mirror had landed. Henry, of course, unrolled the canvas like a man unboxing a fantasy. One look at her serene face, and boom, smitten. "She's perfect," he reportedly declared. "As I do behold her picture, methinks I see virtue." Translation: "She looks quiet enough not to argue with me." Let's pause there. Henry had reached that delicate midlife stage where men start buying convertibles or wives. His waistline had declared independence. His leg ulcers had become local landmarks, and his courtiers pretended the smell was the musk of majesty. Still, he believed himself irresistible, like a decaying Renaissance peacock who refuses to admit he's molting. So when the portrait of and appeared to promise grace and youth, Henry's brain released more endorphins than a Tudor feast released grease. He didn't even meet her before declaring the wedding on. His counsel tried to slow him down, diplomatically whispering things like, "Perhaps, sire, we should arrange an initial audience." But Henry was already practicing his wedding speeches and signing letters that read like badly written love notes mixed with trade contracts. "She shall be my joy and comfort," he announced, as if joy were a thing he could legislate. The entire court started pretending enthusiasm. Ambassadors congratulated him. Bishops blessed the union. And even his jesters started making jokes about how long this wife might last. Everyone laughed nervously because in Tudor England, laughter was a survival mechanism. Meanwhile, in Germany, Anne of Cleves had no idea she was about to be yeeted into the chaos dimension known as Henry's personal life. Her brother agreed to the match for the political benefits. an alliance between Protestant England and the German states, convenient and polite and obedient, prepared to meet her future husband as duty demanded. No romance, no illusions, just a royal obligation wrapped in sea travel and uncomfortable gowns. Now, here's where it gets painfully ironic. Holbein had done his job honestly. His portrait wasn't flattery, just accuracy. But when you're painting for a king with self-esteem issues, accuracy is an act of rebellion. Henry looked at the portrait and saw what he wanted, not what was. A gentle woman, sure, but he filled in the blanks with fantasy. In his mind, she was witty, passionate, fluent in English, maybe even impressed by his musical abilities. In reality, and barely spoke his language, had never danced a galliard, and probably thought lute playing sounded like an illness. This is the original catfish story, and the punchline is eternal. Expectation met reality, and reality filed for divorce. Still, preparations marched on. Henry built her rooms, ordered gifts, and designed a lavish entry into England. Imagine thousands of courtiers and servants bustling to welcome a woman no one had met, decorating halls with banners bearing her initials intertwined with his. The public rejoiced because every new queen meant another holiday and another excuse for ale. But in the corners of Whitehall, some whispered doubts. Those who'd met Anne's envoys described her as kind but unsophisticated. She didn't speak French or Latin, the languages of court diplomacy. Henry's ambassadors in Cleves tried to explain gently that Anne's beauty was of the inner kind, a diplomatic phrase meaning, "Temper expectations, your majesty." Henry ignored it. "Nonsense," he said. "The painter has done well." Then he strutted off to write romantic fantasies about a woman he hadn't met, as if trying to gaslight fate itself. Now picture Holbein, poor man, pacing his studio, probably praying the lighting had been kind enough to survive royal scrutiny. You can almost hear him muttering, "Dear God, please don't let him blame me when he finds out people look different from paintings." Spoiler, that prayer won't age well. So why was this portrait so important? Because it wasn't just love, it was propaganda. Henry needed to show Europe that England wasn't isolated after his break from the Pope. The Cleves alliance promised Protestant unity against Catholic powers. If Anne looked regal and gentle in public art, then the union looked blessed. The wedding wasn't romance, it was insurance. But under that strategy simmered a fragile ego. Henry still wanted to believe he was desirable, that women trembled in admiration when he entered the room. He wanted Anne to be smitten on sight, a walking validation of his own myth. That's not diplomacy. That's midlife crisis with a crown. When the news arrived that Anne was on her way to England, the court went into performance mode. Musicians rehearsed, cooks roasted, tailors stitched garments fit for a woman who didn't yet have a single English word. Henry, impatient, couldn't wait for her official arrival. He planned a grand surprise, a romantic gesture ripped straight from a badly written knight's tale. He'd disguise himself, meet her in secret, and test her reaction. Because nothing says royal chivalry like cosplay and emotional entrapment. Let's pause again and breathe that in. A king with chronic pain, poor impulse control, and the subtlety of a marching band decides to play peekaboo diplomacy with a foreign princess. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. But that's chapter 3. Because when Henry finally saw her in person, the real, unfiltered human and of Cleves, he reacted like a man who'd ordered steak and got oatmeal. There's a thin line between romance and public embarrassment, and in December 1539, Henry VIII pole-vaulted over it wearing a feathered hat. Anne of Cleves had spent weeks sailing through winter storms to reach England. Imagine the nerves. A young woman leaving her homeland forever, knowing she's about to marry a man whose reputation precedes him like thunder before lightning. The wind howls, the sea heaves, and somewhere in the distance, she's probably wondering why royal love stories always start with nausea. By the time she lands in England, she's pale, seasick, and wrapped in about 17 layers of German wool, practical, modest, and not remotely designed for impressing a man who thinks courtly fashion means as much gold thread as humanly possible. But the people of England cheer as she rides toward London. For them, she's hope in human form, a promise that their king will stop collecting wives like trading cards and focus on governing. Meanwhile, Henry, the human embodiment of a red flag, decides that the best way to meet his new bride is in disguise. He's convinced he's a romantic hero from an old poem. The plan? He'll surprise her with a kiss before revealing his royal identity. Because apparently, nothing says true love like accosting a stranger mid-journey. Let's take a moment. You're Anne of Cleves. You've never met this man. You're in a strange country surrounded by strangers. And suddenly, an overweight, limping man with a face like reheated regret barges in, grabs your hand, and tries to kiss you. You'd be startled too. And, ever polite, steps back. She doesn't scream, but she definitely doesn't swoon. She offers the proper German curtsy, confused but respectful. The courtiers around them freeze, trying to decide whether to laugh, faint, or pretend this is normal. Henry, on the other hand, takes it personally. He's humiliated that she didn't recognize him, because apparently, in his mind, his divine aura should have given him away. He storms off, muttering that she's nothing so fair as she hath been reported, which, translated from royal ego speak, means, I'm angry she didn't instantly fall in love with me. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the world's first documented case of the vibes were off, when he later confides to his advisors that, I like her not. The words echo through the palace like a bad review, but it's too late. The political machinery is in motion. Treaties signed, gifts exchanged, banners printed. There's no backing out without offending Germany and reigniting half of Europe. Henry, trapped by his own diplomacy, now faces the nightmare every impulsive dater fears. A wedding he can't cancel. And bless her is trying. She smiles, she learns English phrases. She acts with grace while her groom sulks like a child whose birthday cake arrived in the wrong flavor. She has no idea why he's so cold. No one tells her the romantic disguise incident turned her future husband into a sulking volcano of resentment. Court, everyone pretends not to notice. The courtiers tiptoe through conversations as if the air itself might explode. Holbein, the painter, is suddenly very hard to find. Henry's closest friends whisper that maybe the king's disappointment has less to do with Anne's looks and more to do with, let's say, personal performance issues. After all, Henry hasn't exactly been the picture of health lately. That infected leg didn't make anyone feel romantic. But, of course, it's easier to blame the woman than the mirror. So he decides and must be unsuitable, though no one can quite define why. She's kind. She's pious. She's obedient. She's just not whatever fantasy Henry constructed in his head. Their wedding approaches anyway. Looming like an obligation everyone's pretending is a celebration. Courtiers whisper bets on how long this one will last. The people cheer in the streets, blissfully unaware their monarch is dreading the honeymoon. And speaking of honeymoons, let's talk about that royal chemistry. On their first night together, Henry later claims he liked her body not, and that he found her nothing of beauty. But those are his words, not history's truth. The man had the self-awareness of a brick wall. By this point, he's middle-aged, chronically ill, and insecure. His pride demands that someone be blamed for the failure of desire, and Anne, being foreign, reserved, and conveniently non-threatening, becomes the scapegoat. And herself? She never complains. In letters, she writes of her gratitude, her respect, her hope to please the king. She has no idea the court is already spinning rumors that she's dull or lacking sophistication. She just assumes English customs are weird, which, to be fair, they absolutely were. There's something tragically funny about it all. Two people bound by politics and expectation, speaking different languages, literally and emotionally, and trying to find chemistry in a room full of royal spies. It's like watching two co-workers forced to share a cubicle during a fire drill. Let's slow down here. You can almost imagine Anne standing in her chamber, staring at the strange man she's been told is her husband, and wondering what exactly went wrong. She's thousands of miles from home. She's done everything right. And yet the air between them feels colder than the Thames in January. And Henry? He's pacing the hallways, cursing the portrait that deceived him. though really, it only reflected his delusions. He thought he could order attraction the way he orders armor. But love, inconveniently, does not follow royal decree. Still, the wedding must go on. On January 6, 1540, England dresses in finery, trumpets blare, and the king scowls through the entire ceremony, and smiles because that's what she's supposed to do. The irony is brutal. She's marrying a man already plotting how to be rid of her. The guests cheer, the church bells ring, and England collectively exhales. At last, stability. They have no idea this marriage will be over in 6 months. Because while and dreams of peace and duty, Henry is already preparing excuses. And his favorite one is as fragile as his ego. God did not inflame my heart toward her. Translation: he just wasn't feeling it. By the time the royal bedchamber door closes, the king's heart and other organs have already checked out. And that, dear viewer, is how the grand romance of Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves began. Not with fireworks, but with a polite curtsy and the sound of an ego deflating in real time. By the time of the wedding, Henry already wanted out. But politics wouldn't let him. Yet, January 6, 1540, a freezing winter morning in Greenwich. The Thames is rimmed with ice. The bells of the palace chapel toll like they're announcing a coronation and a crime at the same time. The crowd has gathered, swaddled in fur and gossip. Inside, Henry VIII stands at the altar looking like a man forced to attend his own surprise party. Beside him, Anne of Cleves glows with awkward optimism. The ceremony begins, but even the priests can sense the energy is off. Henry mumbles his vows like a hostage reading a ransom note, and when it comes time to kiss the bride, he hesitates just long enough for everyone in the room to notice. Courtiers exchange glances, that silent Tudor language of, "We're all doomed, but let's keep smiling." Outside, trumpets blare, heralds announce the union to cheering crowds, and Londoners throw flowers in celebration. But inside the royal mind, Henry is spiraling. He feels trapped in a painting he doesn't like. He convinces himself he's been tricked, catfished by diplomacy and oil paint. Still, he plays along because at this point, calling it off would cause an international meltdown. That night, the honeymoon begins. Henry, already dreading the ordeal, complains that Anne's conversation is unrefined. Translation: she doesn't flirt in his language or flatter his ego. The truth? She's just being respectful. A German princess trying to navigate the maze of English manners. She's sober, calm, and likely terrified. But Henry, ever the Renaissance drama king, interprets her modesty as coldness. Now, according to his later accounts, the royal bedchamber was less honeymoon suite and more two strangers awkwardly sharing an Airbnb. He claims he liked her not and that nothing happened, which is a very Tudor way of saying, "It's not you, it's my gout." He tells his physician that he found her body in such sort that I could never be stirred to know her. That's historian speak for the royal engine refused to start. And here's where the sarcasm practically writes itself. Instead of admitting that age, ulcers, and a lifetime of indulgence might have dulled his passion, Henry decides the problem must be Anne. It's the 1500s version of blaming the Wi-Fi when the problem's your router. The next morning, Anne rises cheerful and courteous, assuming all went well. She thanks God for her new husband. Henry, on the other hand, tells his advisors it's over before it's begun. One can almost picture Cromwell, the poor minister who arranged this whole thing, rubbing his temples and mentally drafting his resignation letter. Spoiler: he won't live long enough to send it. But here's the real irony. In public, Henry keeps up appearances. He smiles, attends feasts, gives and jewels. The court whispers that maybe, just maybe, things will improve. After all, how bad could it be? Answer: bad enough that Henry starts consulting bishops about the theological loopholes for annulment. It's barely been a week. Meanwhile, Anne continues to play her part with unshakable grace. She attends ceremonies, learns English customs, even tries to dance, though she finds the court's elaborate flirting rituals exhausting. She's simple in her habits, gentle in speech, and oblivious to the emotional storm brewing around her. You can't help but feel for her. She didn't ask for passion, just peace. Let's pause for a second and imagine the tension. The King of England sulking through his own marriage, the court holding its collective breath, ambassadors trying to decode his moods like they're reading scripture. Henry's pride is wounded, his masculinity in question. His advisors terrified to mention anything that might set him off. And oh, how the rumors fly. Some whisper that Anne has bad breath. Others say she dresses badly. Someone even claims she smells of foreign air. It's propaganda by humiliation, the court gossip machine working overtime to rewrite reality in favor of the king. Still, on the outside, everything looks perfect. The couple appears at banquets. Artists paint flattering portraits of their union. The people rejoice for now. But the king's disgust festers quietly. It's no longer about Anne's looks or her accent. It's about control. Henry's used to bending the world to his will, and suddenly hears this gentle woman who doesn't worship him, who meets his tantrums with quiet civility. For a man like Henry, that silence is the worst insult of all. The more he stews, the more absurd his reasoning becomes. He tells Cromwell, she is not as men have reported her. He insists that he was deceived by the likeness of a picture. Again, the man literally blames a painting for his own midlife crisis. Holbein, somewhere in the distance, probably starts packing a go-bag. But there's a deeper truth hiding beneath all the royal whining. Henry wasn't just disappointed in Anne, he was disappointed in himself. The years of indulgence, the wounds that wouldn't heal, the creeping suspicion that his golden youth was gone forever, and was simply the mirror that reflected it. Let that sink in. The man who built an empire on power and ego couldn't bear the sight of a woman who reminded him he was mortal. As winter drags on, their Cold War continues behind closed doors. The court can sense the frost. Servants whisper of separate bedrooms, of forced smiles at breakfast. Yet Anne, ever dutiful, never complains. She prays. She writes to her brother that she is well content. You almost wish someone would tell her that her husband is planning her political obituary between banquets. And then, the plot twist nobody expected. Henry's eyes wander. A new lady-in-waiting, young, lively, named Catherine Howard, begins catching his attention. The contrast is irresistible to him, and his quiet stability. Catherine is chaos in perfume. Henry starts fantasizing about trading his queen for a younger model, because history truly does repeat itself, especially when ego is doing the steering. Behind the laughter of feasts and the glitter of jewels, a quiet disaster is forming. Every compliment Henry gives Catherine is an unspoken insult to Anne. Every night he avoids her chamber is another nail in the coffin of their marriage. And yet, Anne continues smiling. She believes she's fulfilling her duty. She doesn't realize that her husband is already consulting the church about invalidating their bond. The court knows it. Cromwell knows it. Even the servants can feel it in the silence of the corridors, that tension before an explosion. Henry VIII is about to do what Henry VIII does best. Ruin lives in the name of self-justification. And the excuse he's about to use to end the marriage? It might be the pettiest royal breakup line in history. If you've ever seen someone break up over text because they didn't want to do it face-to-face, congratulations, you already understand Henry VIII's divorce strategy. Only difference? His version involved an archbishop, parliament, and the destruction of someone's life. By spring of 1540, the marriage between Henry and Anne was about as alive as his sense of self-awareness. The king had officially entered the making excuses phase, inventing reasons to undo the thing he'd publicly celebrated months earlier. He couldn't simply say, "I'm not attracted to her." No, that would make him sound human. Instead, he claimed divine displeasure, legal loopholes, and an impressive mix of medical fiction. In short, he built a breakup case so elaborate it could have doubled as a conspiracy theory. His first excuse? Non-consummation, meaning he told everyone that the royal bed remained tragically untroubled. He confided in his physician that he could not be stirred. The physician, probably questioning every career choice he'd ever made, just nodded. Henry followed up with the truly historical line, "She is a goodly woman, but I like her not." Translation: She's fine, but she didn't trigger my main character energy. This created a problem. In Tudor England, royal bedroom performance wasn't just gossip, it was politics. If the king couldn't perform, it wasn't his problem. It was a national crisis. So, to protect his image, the story had to become Anne's fault. Word spread. The queen was dull, foreign, not comely. The courtiers repeated it like parrots with a death wish. Even Cromwell, the poor man who arranged the marriage, had to stand by as Henry rewrote history in real time. And, for her part, remained graciously oblivious. She still called him my husband, attended court, and thanked God for her good fortune. It's almost unbearable to think about. This woman who truly believed she was doing her duty while everyone around her prepared her downfall. Then, in June 1540, the hammer dropped. The council informed and that an investigation had begun into the validity of her marriage. The king's conscience, they said, is troubled. You can almost hear the collective eye roll of history. The same man who invented new religions to justify his love life suddenly discovered morality. And didn't rage. She didn't argue. She simply went quiet. Because unlike the rest of the royal wives, and wasn't playing to win, she was playing to survive. She had seen what happened to women who defied Henry. Catherine of Aragon spent her last years exiled and heartbroken, and Boleyn lost her head. Jane Seymour died giving him the heir he demanded. And now it was Anne's turn in the Tudor spin cycle. The council pressed her to confess that the marriage was invalid, that she had never truly been Henry's wife. The legal gymnastics were laughable. Henry claimed he had been forced into the union by his advisors, and had been pre-contracted to another man years before. Essentially, it was the royal version of, "I thought we were just hanging out," and was questioned politely but firmly. And to everyone's surprise, she didn't fight back. She nodded. She agreed. She accepted the annulment without a single protest. Historians have debated this moment for centuries. Was it submission or strategy? Personally, I think it was brilliance disguised as compliance, and knew exactly what game she was in, and how to win it. The last thing she wanted was a martyr's legacy. She wanted peace, safety, and a steady income. You can't spend a crown if you're dead. When the decree was finalized in July, Anne received the news with an astonishing calm. She was no longer queen, but she was also not executed, not exiled, and not ruined. Henry, perhaps out of guilt or rare flashes of decency, granted her a generous settlement, 2 lavish estates, a royal income, and the honorary title of the king's beloved sister, which, if you think about it, is the most passive-aggressive title in history. Sorry we annulled your marriage, but please come to family dinner, and took it all with quiet dignity. She moved into her new home, Richmond Palace, decorated it with tapestries, and settled into a life of comfortable detachment. She hunted, gardened, and built friendships with Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, the same girls who had seen their own mothers destroyed by their father's whims, and, miraculously, became something of a maternal figure to them. Let's take a moment to appreciate the poetic irony here. In a kingdom obsessed with power, this so-called failed queen outmaneuvered one of the most dangerous men in history by doing nothing. She didn't fight. She yielded. She let Henry's ego devour itself. And in the ashes, she walked away with her life, her freedom, and enough property to keep herself comfortable until the end of her days. Cromwell, the man who had orchestrated the marriage, wasn't so lucky. Just days after Anne's annulment, Henry turned on him too, accusing him of treason and heresy. The same king who once praised Cromwell as his most faithful servant now sent him to the executioner. As the axe fell, Cromwell's last thought may very well have been, "Should have used a different painter." Meanwhile, Anne was living her best divorced life. She exchanged friendly letters with Henry, attended his court occasionally, and even received gifts. He called her "my sister," and for once he meant it. She'd done the impossible, escaped Henry's marriage without losing her head or her bank account. Let that sink in. In a time when women's fates were signed in ink and sealed with blood, Anne of Cleves negotiated herself into safety with grace, intelligence, and not a single drop of arrogance. We often praise bold defiance in history, rebellion, speeches, sword fights. But sometimes the quiet kind of power lasts longer. The kind that smiles, nods, and survives while everyone else burns. Anne's failure became her freedom. She had no crown, but she had something infinitely rarer in Tudor England: peace. And Henry? He moved on, of course, to Catherine Howard, a young woman whose charm reignited his vanity and whose fate would prove, once again, that being loved by a king was the most dangerous job in the realm. And watched all this unfold from her peaceful estate, sipping wine and counting rent money. She may have been the rejected queen, but she was also the last one laughing. Because sometimes survival is victory, and Anne of Cleves just turned royal humiliation into a masterclass in self-preservation. But her calm surrender wasn't weakness. It was the smartest move any Tudor woman ever made. If history were a high school yearbook, Anne of Cleves would have been voted most likely to accidentally survive Henry VIII. After her annulment, she didn't vanish into exile or prison like most royal ex-wives. No, she pulled off the impossible. A peaceful retirement, royal allowance, and zero head trauma. Her new title, the King's Beloved Sister, sounded wholesome enough, but everyone knew it was royal code for friend-zoned by the throne. Still, Anne wasn't complaining. She'd gone from doomed queen to England's most eligible bachelorette in one royal signature. Her divorce settlement included multiple estates, a small army of servants, and an annual income that would make most nobles weep with envy. While Henry strutted around court pretending the annulment was a moral triumph, and quietly unpacked her trunks at Richmond Palace and began her new life. For the first time, she could breathe without every inhale depending on a man's mood swing. Picture her walking through the gardens at dusk, the Thames glinting nearby, realizing she was finally free, not just from Henry, but from the cage of being queen. Meanwhile, the court was buzzing. People expected her to flee back to Germany in shame. Instead, she redecorated. Out went the cold austerity of Cleves. In came rich English tapestries, imported spices, laughter, music, dogs. So many dogs. It's like she reinvented divorce as a lifestyle brand centuries before it was trendy. Even Henry seemed impressed. He started visiting her casually, the king popping by like an ex who's realized the breakup was his fault. "My sister," and he'd say, trying not to look guilty while inspecting her redecorated estate. And Anne, ever the diplomat, would smile graciously and pour him wine. She didn't gloat. She didn't flirt. She simply lived well, which in Henry's court was the most subversive revenge imaginable. There's a famous line by a chronicler who described Anne's post-royal existence as merry and good-humored. That's historian speak for she was thriving. She hunted, hosted dinners, and even joined royal events. A reminder that she was still part of the Tudor tapestry, even if she'd stepped out of its bloodier threads. Henry's other wives, however, weren't doing so well. Catherine Howard, his new teenage queen, danced on a knife's edge of attention. While and embroidered quietly by candlelight, Catherine twirled in jewels, thinking love would keep her safe. It's hard not to see the irony brewing, and the woman once mocked as plain was now serene, respected, and alive. Catherine, the beautiful one, was headed straight for the chopping block. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, Anne was in her soft era. She dressed elegantly but simply, adopting English fashion while keeping a hint of her German modesty. She sent letters to her brother back in Cleves assuring him that she was happy, and for once, a Tudor woman actually meant it. Even Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, adored her. Both had lived through the trauma of their mother's downfalls, and they found something they'd never had before: a safe woman in the palace. She treated them kindly without ambition or competition. In a court built on rivalry, that alone was revolutionary. Let's pause for a moment and appreciate this. Anne of Cleves was the only one of Henry's 6 wives who managed to leave his orbit without tragedy. She didn't die, didn't get exiled, didn't get branded a witch, and didn't need an army to defend her honor. She simply outlasted him. And yet, her peace didn't come without whispers. Some courtiers still mocked her behind fans and goblets. The Flanders mare, they called her. An insult supposedly coined by Henry himself. The phrase caught on because cruelty always travels faster than truth. But Anne never dignified it with a response. Instead, she embodied the ultimate power move, indifference. Because she knew something the others didn't, she had already won. While the court danced around Henry's moods like moths near a bonfire, and sat comfortably in the shadows, warm and untouched, she'd traded power for permanence, and in Tudor England, that was the only trade that ever paid off. Still, you can't help but imagine what those dinners must have been like when Henry visited. The air thick with unspoken irony. The king, older, heavier, limping, trying to act chummy while and played the gracious hostess. Maybe deep down he admired her composure. Or maybe he just missed being around someone who didn't treat him like a god or a monster. Sometimes she even visited court, turning heads not with beauty, but with presence. People whispered, "There goes the queen who wasn't," and she would smile as if to say, "Yes, and look how that worked out for me." Now here's where the tone softens. Beneath the humor and irony, and story carries something deeply human. The quiet satisfaction of finding peace where others sought glory. Maybe she understood something Henry never could. That love isn't ownership, and freedom isn't failure. Let that sink in. A woman once mocked by an entire empire for being undesirable was now living better than anyone who'd ever worn his ring. By 1541, when Catherine Howard's scandal began to unravel, adultery, betrayal, execution, and stayed politely silent. She didn't gloat, she didn't laugh, but history might have. The contrast was almost poetic. The boring queen had outlasted the beautiful one. And of Cleves, the misfit, the outsider, the woman everyone underestimated, was quietly rewriting what it meant to win. She was no longer a queen, but she was finally herself. And yet, history has a way of reminding people that peace in Henry's orbit never lasts forever. Because while Anne was settling into her happily ever after, the storm clouds were gathering again, and this time they were soaked in blood. But as history proves, no woman near Henry VIII ever stays safe for long. If there was ever a moment in Tudor history that deserved the tagline "Karma with a crown," this was it. While Anne of Cleves was out in Richmond sipping wine, feeding her dogs, and doing the 1500s equivalent of self-care Sundays, Henry VIII's brand new wife, the young, dazzling Catherine Howard, was about to star in the bloodiest rebound story in English history. Let's rewind a little. Henry married Catherine just a few weeks after annulling his marriage to Anne. She was 19. He was, well, imagine the world's most powerful man trapped in the body of a spoiled ham. Henry called Catherine his rose without a thorn. Everyone else called her a walking accident. The court went wild for her. She was lively, musical, flirtatious, everything and wasn't. But what the courtiers didn't know, or pretended not to, was that Catherine's past wasn't exactly spotless. And in a world where a woman's virtue was treated like national property, that was a ticking time bomb. Now, here's where the irony gets delicious. While Catherine was spinning through dances and gossip, and was thriving in serene obscurity, the public adored her. She was the only one of Henry's ex-wives who hadn't died, vanished, or started a war. Common folk saw her as something of a folk heroine, the woman too good, too smart, or too lucky to be destroyed by the king's love life. Letters from ambassadors around this time describe Anne as good-humored and much esteemed. She attended feasts, rode in the countryside, and even sent Henry little gifts now and then. Picture the level of confidence it takes to send a fruit basket to your ex, the same ex who executed his last 2 wives. That's next-level emotional detachment. Meanwhile, in the palace, Catherine Howard's life was unraveling faster than Henry's waistcoat ties. Rumors started whispering through the corridors that the young queen had been seen meeting someone in secret, that her virtue wasn't as pure as advertised. Henry, blissfully unaware, strutted around in love, convinced he'd finally rediscovered his youth. Then came the scandal. In November 1541, a letter reached Henry while he was praying in the chapel. It accused Catherine of adultery. The king froze. Witnesses said his face turned so pale they thought he'd collapse. Then came the rage. the same kind of rage that had once burned Anne Boleyn's head from her shoulders. Within days, Catherine was arrested. The once rose without a thorn became the queen without a chance. And here's where the universe decided to add a flourish of poetic justice. Anne of Cleves was invited back to court, yes, invited to help with the diplomatic cleanup. Henry, in a stunning display of denial, began publicly calling her his good sister again, visiting her estates, and treating her with the warmth he hadn't shown during their marriage. It's hard not to imagine Anne's private thoughts during all this. She had no reason to gloat. But come on, she had to feel a little vindicated. The same man who humiliated her was now begging for her company, realizing too late that stability was far more attractive than scandal. The French ambassador at the time noted that Henry spoke with much affection of the Lady Anne, which, in Tudor terms, means he was reminiscing about the one woman who didn't ruin his life, or, more accurately, the one woman whose life he didn't ruin. Catherine Howard, meanwhile, was dragged from Hampton Court screaming Henry's name. She begged for mercy. There was none. By February 1542, she was executed on Tower Green, barely a year after her wedding. The public reaction was shock, exhaustion, and maybe just a bit of grim satisfaction. The beautiful one was gone. The ugly one still alive. History, it seemed, had a wicked sense of humor, and reportedly received the news with quiet sadness. No laughter, no smugness, just a heavy sigh, maybe the kind you let out when you've seen too much human folly to be surprised anymore. She even prayed for Catherine's soul, because of course she did. That's who Anne was. Let's take a moment to step out of the royal soap opera and breathe this in. The same woman Henry once rejected as unworthy was now his most trusted companion. The man who accused her of being plain and dull now sought her company in his loneliest moments. That's not just irony, that's character development. And here's the real twist. Henry started inviting Anne to family gatherings. She was often seated next to his daughters, treated with open respect. The courtiers whispered, "Will the king remarry her?" Imagine that, the comeback of the century. The king who annulled their marriage might have actually considered making her queen again. Of course, it never happened. Henry's pride wouldn't let him, and Anne wasn't foolish enough to volunteer for round two. Still, it shows how dramatically her image had changed. In a court obsessed with appearances, Anne had become something rare, trusted. She wrote to her family in Cleves that she was content, that the king treated her honorably, and that she desired nothing more than peace. There's a calm strength in that line. After all, peace is the one thing none of Henry's other wives ever got to keep. So let's pause, mid-chapter, for one of those reflective breaths, the kind the story deserves. The ugly queen who failed at marriage outlived the beautiful one who succeeded at seduction. The woman mocked for her plainness became a symbol of quiet survival in a world that devoured women for sport. Let that irony settle for a second, heavy, bittersweet, and a little funny if you tilt your head the right way. Because in the end, history didn't remember Anne of Cleves as the boring queen or the failed bride. It remembered her as something better, the one who got away. But here's the haunting part. Henry wasn't done haunting her. His moods, his ego, his legacy, they had a way of dragging everyone back into orbit. And even though Anne stayed smartly out of the throne's blast radius, the turbulence of the Tudor world was far from over. Because when Henry died, and he would, leaving behind chaos and creditors, Anne's name would surface again in the strange, ghostly politics of the post-Tudor court. She might have escaped the man, but the shadow of his crown? That lingered. And when Henry died, Anne's story still wasn't over. When Henry VIII finally died in 1547, England let out a collective sigh, half grief, half exhaustion. The man had ruled for nearly 4 decades, and by the end, the kingdom felt like a traumatized family tiptoeing around the world's angriest dad. His body gave out before his ego ever did, and rumor has it, the smell reached the hallways before the news reached the people. But somewhere far from the stench of royal decay, Anne of Cleves stood quietly in her manor at Chelsea, listening to church bells toll for the man who had once been her husband, sort of. And for a brief moment, she probably wondered what emotion she was supposed to feel. Relief? Gratitude? Maybe just a touch of sympathy? After all, he'd given her freedom by accident. The irony was absurd. Out of 6 wives, she was one of only 2 who survived him, and the only one who was still on good terms with the crown. While Jane Seymour had been sainted in death and Catherine Parr barely survived her own political husband-hopping, and remained steady, invisible yet respected, wealthy but discreet. She was, in essence, the ghost of the throne, present everywhere, haunting no one. After Henry's death, the royal household restructured faster than you could say succession crisis. His 9-year-old son, Edward VI, took the throne under the guidance of power-hungry uncles and advisors who saw opportunity in chaos. The palace halls filled with new faces and fresh paranoia. It was déjà vu, same power games, new players. Only this time, she was wise enough to keep her distance. Picture it. The young boy king in his gilded chair, scribbling signatures he barely understands. The council squabbling over religion, taxes, and titles. And in the background, Anne of Cleves, quietly sipping tea in her estate, watching it all unfold like someone who's already seen every episode of this drama and knows how it ends. But even in retirement, Anne was a political ghost no one could ignore. She was still a former queen, still foreign royalty, and still wealthy enough to attract both admiration and suspicion. Courtiers came to visit her, some genuinely fond, others fishing for gossip or patronage. She smiled, entertained, and sent them home none the wiser. Every once in a while, she was invited to royal events, coronations, banquets, processions. She'd arrive in fine silks, bearing gifts, and bow just the right amount to remind everyone she used to be a queen, but didn't need to be one anymore. Her presence was like a polite echo from a past no one dared mention. Even the new rulers treated her with a strange mix of reverence and guilt. Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, adored her, and had been kind to them when no one else dared. She gave them advice, gifts, and more importantly, safety. For 2 girls raised in the wreckage of their fathers' marriages, Anne's calm presence must have felt like sunlight after years of storms. When Elizabeth later became queen, she carried that memory with her. That women could wield power without cruelty. That lesson came from Anne of Cleves. Still, Anne's peace was never absolute. The political climate in post-Henry England was a minefield. Protestant reformers and Catholic loyalists clawed at each other for dominance. Friends became enemies overnight. Titles changed hands faster than gossip. One day you were a duke. The next you were dinner for the Tower Ravens. And walked that tightrope like a professional. She avoided politics, made no public statements, and refused to take sides. Her letters during this period are the epitome of survival diplomacy, gracious, vague, and always ending with "your humble servant." It was her way of saying, "Don't drag me into your nonsense." But even she couldn't avoid the occasional royal paranoia. In 1550, there were whispers that Anne might remarry, possibly to a foreign noble or even to Edward's uncle, Thomas Seymour, who, ironically, was also flirting with the young Princess Elizabeth at the same time. It was nonsense, of course, but in Tudor England, nonsense could get you killed. And quickly quashed the rumors by doing absolutely nothing, the most powerful move in her arsenal. By then, she had settled into a kind of mythic role in English society, not quite queen, not quite commoner. The people still remembered her fondly. To them, she was the gentle foreign lady who'd been too good for Henry. The poets ignored her. The historians downplayed her. But the public never forgot her calm face, her quiet laugh, her miraculous survival. And yet, that ghost label fits for another reason too. Despite living among them, Anne was never truly of them. She was the foreigner who stayed, the queen who didn't rule, the woman who existed in the cracks between England's chaos and memory. Her letters often reveal a kind of homesickness, not for Cleves itself, but for simplicity, for belonging. Let's slow down here. Imagine her in her chamber at dusk, a fire crackling low, writing by candlelight. The laughter of servants drifts from the hall. She dips her quill, pauses, and smiles softly, because she's thinking about how absurd life is. She crossed oceans to marry a man who didn't want her, and yet here she is, years later, at peace in the very country that once mocked her. That's not tragedy. That's quiet victory. The historians call this her contented years. She entertained visitors, exchanged gifts with the royal family, and managed her estates with sharp intelligence. She wasn't a romantic heroine or a political schemer, just a woman who outlived her own reputation. Still, there's something poetic about how her life lingered around the edges of power. She was the queen who wasn't, and yet, she never really left the throne's shadow. Every new monarch owed her something: respect, example, caution, because and had proven a truth the Tudors never could admit. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one who chooses to walk out of it. And though Henry's death freed her from his rule, it didn't free her from his legacy. His ghost lingered everywhere, in law, in legend, in the uneasy hearts of his children, and lived in that shadow gracefully. But shadows, by nature, grow longer with time. Her peace would soon flicker again, because even after death, Henry's shadow never truly left her. History doesn't give retirement plans to former queens, especially not in Tudor England. For Anne of Cleves, peace was always conditional, like fine print on a royal contract, subject to change without notice. By the time Henry's son, young Edward VI, took the throne, and was technically the safest she'd ever been, but safety in Tudor politics was like sitting in the eye of a hurricane. Still for a moment, doomed in the next. The new Protestant regime was obsessed with purging the old order, and while Anne wasn't exactly a Catholic loyalist, her foreign birth and quiet influence made her inconvenient. At first, she tried to play the game. She wrote letters to the council full of cheerful flattery. "Your Majesty's humble sister thanks God for your health and reign." She sent gifts, attended ceremonies, and kept her religious opinions locked tighter than the Tower gates. Her strategy was clear. Blend in so well they forget you're still here. But blending in gets harder when you used to wear a crown. Even if you're no longer a queen, people still whisper your name in the same breath as power. And began to notice little changes. Her royal income payments came late. Invitations to court stopped arriving. When she did show up, seats she once occupied near the royal family were suddenly filled by younger, flashier nobles. She was no longer the king's beloved sister. Now she was that German widow who used to be somebody. Yet through all that, she kept her poise. Imagine it. A woman who once ruled beside the most dangerous man in England, now quietly sipping her wine at banquets, smiling at gossip she knows she's not meant to hear. There's dignity in that kind of silence, and a subtle revenge in refusing to crumble. Still, even silence has a cost. As Edward's reign grew more radical, Protestant reformers started viewing anyone remotely connected to Catholic traditions as suspicious. Anne's friendship with Princess Mary, Henry's devout Catholic daughter, suddenly looked politically risky. The two women had always shared mutual respect. Mary saw in Anne a survivor who never betrayed her father's daughters, and Anne saw in Mary the rare tutor who treated her like family. Now that friendship became a liability. The council began cutting Anne's allowances, reclaiming estates, and gently reminding her that her position depended on royal favor. Translation: stay quiet, stay out of the way. But Anne had weathered worse. She had watched wives fall, ministers burn, and kingdoms pivot on whims. Compared to that, a few missing rent payments were almost funny. So she smiled, tightened her purse strings, and kept living. There's a letter from around this time where she writes to a friend, "My joy is in quietness and my hope in the Lord." That line says everything. No bitterness, no self-pity. Just a woman who decided that peace was her rebellion. Meanwhile, the young King Edward's court was turning into a religious arms race. Nobles competed over who could be the most Protestant without getting accused of heresy. Statues were smashed, churches stripped bare, and Latin replaced with sermons about thrift and obedience. Two things no Tudor monarch ever practiced. And practical as always, adjusted. She attended Protestant services, nodded when people quoted scripture, and made it clear she wasn't here to stir trouble. But rumors spread anyway. They always did. Some said she was corresponding with her brother in Cleves to plot alliances. Others claimed she secretly supported Mary's claim to the throne. Most of it was nonsense, but nonsense had power in those days. Still, and had an edge. She was foreign-born, meaning, technically, not England's problem. If things got ugly, she could always retreat to Cleves. But she didn't. She stayed. Maybe because she'd come to love England's damp skies and stubborn people. Or maybe because she wanted to prove something. That she belonged here even if history refused to write her in. By 1553, Edward was dying. Painfully, publicly, and surrounded by men already fighting over his crown. As he faded, the question of succession became a knife fight in slow motion. The Protestant nobles pushed for Lady Jane Grey. The people wanted Mary, and watched from her estate, knowing whichever side won, she'd have to adapt again. When Mary finally seized power that summer, London erupted. Bells rang, bonfires burned, and Anne once again stepped out of the shadows. She congratulated Mary personally, sending gifts and warm letters. After all, she'd been one of the few who had ever treated Mary kindly, and now that kindness paid off. The new queen welcomed her back to court with open arms. For a brief moment, it must have felt like stability. Two women, survivors of Henry's madness, sharing quiet dinners and prayers, and was older now, softer, wiser. The years had given her serenity, and in Mary, she saw both tragedy and triumph. The daughter of the wife Henry had wronged most, now sitting on the throne he once ruled with cruelty. But even this peace carried the faint scent of danger. Mary's reign was marked by fire, literally. The Marian persecutions turned England into a furnace of faith, and even the innocent risked being scorched by proximity. And, with her German Protestant roots, suddenly found herself in a theological tightrope act again. To Mary's credit, she protected Anne. The two women remained cordial, but the tension in the air was enough to keep anyone awake at night. Imagine living long enough to see not one, not two, but three versions of England, Catholic, Protestant, then Catholic again, and surviving each without taking a side. That's not luck. That's genius-level self-preservation. And yet, beneath that wisdom was weariness. Anne's letters from these later years grow shorter, gentler, a little sad. She speaks of God's will, quiet rest, and the mercy of time. It's as if she knows she's becoming invisible, that her name, once shouted in the courts of Europe, is fading into footnotes. There's something deeply human about that image. An aging woman sitting by a window, watching the river flow past the city that once cheered her arrival. The bells of Westminster ring, the same as they did on her wedding day, only softer now, like echoes of a story that outlived its teller. Imagine living long enough, the narrator whispers, to see the world that once feared you forget your name, and she did. Anne's estates shrank, her health faltered, and her visits to court became rare. But through it all, she never complained, never begged, never plotted. She simply endured, and in enduring, she outclassed everyone who had ever doubted her. And when death finally came for Anne of Cleves, it arrived gently, almost like respect. The year is 1557. England is cold again, not the sharp chill of winter, but the kind that creeps into the walls of history itself. The bells of Westminster toll softly over the city, announcing the passing of someone few remember to fear, but everyone remembers to respect, Anne of Cleves. She is 41, though time has treated her kindly. Her hair has silvered, her hands have grown frail, but her expression, that calm, almost amused serenity that baffled courtiers for decades, remains untouched. Even in her final days, people describe her as cheerful, gracious, and content. Imagine that, a woman who had every reason to be bitter choosing instead to leave the world with a smile. Her death comes quietly. No drama, no scandal, no executioner polishing his blade. Just candlelight, prayer, and the faint rustle of servants in the background. The same world that once watched Henry's wives rise and fall in blood now watches this woman slip away peacefully, like a ghost exhaling for the last time. When word reaches Queen Mary, she orders that and be buried in Westminster Abbey, a royal honor reserved for very few. Think about that. The woman once dismissed as ugly, foreign, and unworthy of the crown is now laid to rest among kings and queens. History, it seems, finally exhaled and whispered, "You win." Let's pause there. In a dynasty soaked in vanity and violence, Anne's victory was subtle, but absolute. She didn't conquer kingdoms or bear heirs. She didn't command armies or pen reforms. She simply survived. In a time when survival itself was an act of defiance, that was enough. Her funeral is small but dignified. No grand procession, no endless speeches. Just the hum of hymns echoing through stone corridors. Her coffin is draped in velvet, her crest displayed proudly. Courtiers who once mocked her now bow their heads in quiet admiration. Some out of respect, some out of guilt. This poetic justice. Henry VIII lies buried nearby, his body sealed beneath a slab of stone, rotting inside the tomb he once commissioned for himself and Jane Seymour. She the perfect wife, he the great king, both entombed in grandeur, both symbols of power, and both utterly undone by time. Meanwhile, Anne's grave rests quietly in a nearby chapel, marked not by ego, but by endurance. The queen who didn't fight, didn't rage, and didn't die for love is the one who gets the final word. Historians love to say she won the divorce lottery, but that undersells it. She didn't just win. She rewrote the rules of survival in a world that treated women like political furniture. She proved you could navigate chaos without cruelty, bend without breaking, and leave the game without losing your soul. Let's look closer at what that meant. While Henry's other wives are remembered for tragedy, Catherine of Aragon's dignity in exile, and Boleyn's courage on the scaffold, Jane Seymour's death in childbirth, Catherine Howard's panic at the block, and Catherine Parr's exhaustion from outliving yet another husband, and of Cleves stands apart. Her story doesn't end in martyrdom or melodrama. It ends in peace. And that's exactly why history almost forgot her. She didn't make good copy. No betrayal, no blood, no Shakespearean finale. Just a quiet woman outliving a mad dynasty. But sometimes the quietest lives are the most revolutionary. Picture her one last time. A winter morning in Chelsea, the river glinting silver through her window. She's wrapped in a fur-lined robe, sipping warm ale, maybe humming one of those soft German hymns from her childhood. Around her, the servants fuss, not out of fear, but affection. She smiles faintly, the kind of smile that says, "I told you I'd be fine," because she was. She'd turned rejection into independence, and obscurity into freedom. She'd seen kingdoms shift, kings die, faiths burn, and somehow stayed whole through it all. It's tempting to imagine her spirit walking through Westminster Abbey after death, passing the tombs of those who once outshone her. Henry's stone slab, Jane Seymour's resting place, the monuments of men who thought her irrelevant. She'd probably smirk, not cruelly, just knowingly, the kind of smirk that only survivors earn. Maybe she'd pause before Henry's tomb, tilt her head, and whisper something like, "You should have kept the painting." And maybe, somewhere deep inside the Abbey's ancient silence, the ghosts of the Tudor court would agree. Because Anne's life, her endurance, her laughter, her quiet brilliance, was the slow revenge of the underestimated. The world called her boring. She called it peace. Let that settle for a moment. How many people in history, especially women, get to say they lived on their own terms, unbroken, unpunished, and unforgotten? Very few. And did it centuries before self-preservation became a virtue. Her final resting place still stands today, tucked within Westminster Abbey's Gothic sprawl. Most visitors walk past it without noticing. No marble statue, no towering inscription, just a simple marker that reads her name, Anna Regina Anglii, and Queen of England. No asterisk, no apology, just fact. And in that simplicity lies the quiet triumph of her life. The ugly queen, the foreign misfit, the failed wife. In death, she reclaimed every title stripped from her. Maybe that's the real moral of her story. You don't have to burn bright to outshine history. Sometimes you just have to last longer than the flames. So breathe that in, the candlelight, the stone, the echo of hymns fading into silence. And if Cleves is gone, but her peace remains. Because in the Tudor game of love and survival, the only one who truly won was the one who stopped playing. Let's rewind the royal record for a minute. Back before the polite annulments, before the titles, before the wine and peace and post-divorce glow-ups. Back to the moment it all started. A paintbrush, a man with a portfolio, and one of the most expensive miscommunications in history. Because honestly, if the 16th century had social media, this whole mess would have just been a bad Tinder date. Instead, it became a diplomatic disaster. The man at the center of it? Hans Holbein the Younger, painter, genius, occasional victim of royal delusion. Henry VIII's personal artist, responsible for making England's monarchs look slightly less like collapsing furniture. Holbein was a man who understood two things: lighting and survival. In Henry's court, a flattering portrait could save your head. A bad one could send it rolling. So when Henry sent Holbein to Germany in 1539 to paint the sisters of the Duke of Cleves, and Amalia, he wasn't just sending a painter. He was sending his dating app algorithm, his one-man filter, his Photoshop with a pulse. Holbein arrived in Cleves with his sketchbook and the delicate task of capturing beauty without flattery. He couldn't overdo it. If he made and too perfect, the king would expect Venus and get, well, a normal person. But he also couldn't underplay her, or he might insult her powerful family and ruin England's potential alliance. It was a diplomatic tightrope with a brushstroke for balance. The result? A masterpiece. And of Cleves as Holbein saw her. Serene, composed, warm. The painting glowed with dignity. Not seductive, not glamorous, but human. The kind of woman who looked like she'd listen, keep her temper, and manage a household without starting a war. When Holbein returned to England and unveiled the portrait, the court gasped. Henry, who by this point had confused divine right with divine attraction, was smitten instantly. "She is a fair and comely lady," he declared, gazing at the canvas like a man falling in love with a screensaver. He stared at that painting for days. Servants whispered that he'd sneak back to admire it in private, convinced that he'd found his soulmate. That's the thing about loneliness. It doesn't need accuracy. It just needs an image. And here's where the irony gets delicious. Holbein didn't lie. He didn't exaggerate. If anything, he painted and with respectful restraint. The problem wasn't the art, it was the audience. Henry didn't want reality, he wanted fantasy. He saw grace and imagined passion. He saw calm and imagined adoration. It's the same illusion people fall for online now, mistaking filters for compatibility, pixels for connection. You could say Holbein's painting was history's first catfish, except the catfish wasn't the artist or the subject. It was Henry himself. He catfished his own expectations. Let that sink in for a moment. The most powerful man in the world looked at a portrait, fell in love with the idea of a woman, and then blamed everyone else when that idea didn't smile back the way he'd imagined. When Henry finally met Anne, his disappointment wasn't about her looks. It was about his pride. She was fine. She was real. But he was chasing an illusion of youth, desire, and masculine invincibility, things his mirror no longer reflected. And Holbein's portrait, for all its grace, didn't come with a reality disclaimer. Historians have spent centuries arguing over whether Holbein flattered, and the truth? He didn't need to. He just painted her without distortion. The distortion was already in Henry's head. Still, the poor artist caught some heat. After all, kings don't like to be reminded that their romantic instincts are about as sharp as a butter knife. Henry never punished Holbein, maybe because even he knew the man wasn't the problem, but you can bet Holbein learned one thing that day: never paint a woman for a man who hates mirrors. It's fascinating, though, how that portrait still survives. It hangs today in the Louvre, quietly radiant, soft gaze, folded hands, a face that looks like she's keeping one hell of a secret. People still debate whether Holbein captured her beauty or merely her soul. But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the real genius of the painting is that it exposed the vanity of everyone who looked at it. Because if you think about it, the entire Anne of Cleves episode is one long allegory about image and expectation. A mirror we still live in. We scroll through filtered perfection, projecting fantasies onto strangers, confusing appearance for truth, attention for affection. Henry just did it in brocade instead of Wi-Fi. Let's pause here for a reflective breath. Imagine Holbein, standing over his palette, muttering to himself as he paints, "Don't exaggerate, don't offend. Just tell the truth. And centuries later, we're still debating whether he succeeded, because the truth, even when painted honestly, is never what people want to see. Henry didn't want a partner. He wanted a reflection of his power. He wanted to look at Anne and see a man still desirable, still young, still the unstoppable god of his own mythology. When she didn't give him that validation, he called her ugly. But what he was really calling ugly was his own decline. That's the quiet brilliance of Holbein's art. It revealed the limits of illusion. His portrait didn't just capture Anne, it captured the exact moment England's greatest ego met reality and blinked. There's something hauntingly modern about that. Because centuries later, we're still trying to paint ourselves into perfection, to curate, to brand, to filter. And we still recoil when reality walks into the room unannounced. Maybe that's why the Anne of Cleves portrait still feels alive. It's not just a face, it's a warning label. A gentle, painted whisper saying, "Look closer. The truth is still here under the gloss." So the next time you scroll through your feed and feel that twinge of envy for someone else's perfect life, remember Henry VIII, the man who fell in love with a portrait and ended up inventing one of the first documented midlife crises. Turns out, the 1500s invented Instagram. It just used oil paint instead of filters. But maybe, just maybe, the real catfish wasn't the artist or the portrait or even Anne. Maybe the real catfish was the king himself, deceived by his reflection, undone by his vanity, and immortalized by a painting that told the truth he refused to see. By now, Henry VIII is less of a king and more of a cautionary tale with a crown. His body is collapsing, his temper is legendary, and his physicians are running out of polite ways to say, "Sire, perhaps fewer pies?" But the real rot isn't in his leg. It's in his ego. Because under the gold thread and divine titles, Henry is scared. Not of enemies or rebels, he's scared of time, of fading, of becoming mortal in a story he spent his life narrating as divine. You can almost see it in his portraits from these later years. The puffed chest, the dead eyes. He's dressed like God's favorite warlord. But he's posing for immortality he knows he doesn't deserve. And that's what makes Anne of Cleves' story sting him so much. She was the first woman who didn't feed his myth. Let's rewind to that awkward marriage moment one more time. And didn't scream or flatter or cry. She just looked at him, calmly, politely, without awe. For a man whose entire identity was built on worship, that neutrality was devastating. It wasn't that she found him unattractive. It's that she didn't need him to be anything more than human. And that, dear listener, was heresy of the highest order. Henry's entire life had been a performance. When he was young, he was the Renaissance poster boy, tall, athletic, charming, fluent in 6 languages, with a singing voice good enough to make diplomats forget his foreign policy. He truly believed himself to be chosen, a golden god of England. But over time, that illusion crumbled. Gout, ulcers, paranoia, all the side effects of unchecked power. By his 40s, he'd become the monarch equivalent of a collapsing cathedral. Grand, decayed, and pretending the scaffolding was decorative. And every time he looked at Anne healthy, composed, unbothered, it reminded him that no amount of flattery could rebuild his youth. This is what psychologists today might call projection. In Tudor terms, it was just Tuesday. Henry blamed and supposed plainness for his lack of desire. But really, it was his own body betraying him. The same man who once jousted before thousands now needed help walking across a room. His armor no longer fit, his hair thinned, and his breath. Well, let's just say candlelight was his best lighting. And yet, his courtiers still pretended he was magnificent, because to contradict the illusion was treason. Imagine the entire country trapped in a group chat where you're not allowed to stop complimenting the admin. That's what made Anne dangerous. She didn't play along. She wasn't rude or defiant. She simply existed outside his fantasy. When Henry joked, she smiled politely. When he boasted, she listened kindly. That small gap between admiration and tolerance was unbearable to him. It's why he reacted so harshly. Why he humiliated her with talk of annulment and rumors. Because deep down, he knew her indifference had revealed his secret. Henry VIII was no longer the prize. And this right here is the heart of his insecurity complex. Every new wife wasn't just a partner. She was a mirror. Catherine of Aragon reflected his youth and legitimacy. And Boleyn reflected his rebellion. Jane Seymour reflected his fragile hope for legacy. Catherine Howard reflected his denial. And Anne of Cleves? She reflected the truth. That he wasn't lovable, just powerful. Let's breathe that in for a moment, because it's one of history's great ironies. Henry executed and discarded women for failing to meet impossible standards, all because he couldn't bear to see himself clearly. His greatest enemy wasn't Rome or France or any of his doomed wives. It was the moment he realized the mirror no longer flattered him. Anne's composure made that moment inescapable. She never insulted him, never argued, never begged, which made it worse. How do you destroy someone who refuses to fight you? He couldn't humiliate her because she wouldn't react. He couldn't make her jealous because she was already free. He couldn't even erase her because her continued existence mocked his chaos. There's a strange tenderness in that dynamic, one that history rarely credits. For all his cruelty, Henry seemed to trust, and in a way he trusted no one else. After their annulment, he'd visit her casually, even confide in her. When he needed calm, he turned to the woman he once called ugly. That's not romance. That's emotional dependence disguised as politeness. She represented something he couldn't destroy: stability. You can imagine the conversations between them in those later years. Henry, older, swollen with regret, talking too much about his glory days, and, sipping wine, nodding gently, replying with the careful distance of someone who's learned that pity is safer than honesty. He probably saw in her what he'd lost: grace, dignity, endurance. And she saw in him exactly what he was: a man consumed by his own myth, too fragile to live without it. Modern historians love to analyze Henry as a political genius, a religious reformer, a tyrant. But underneath all that royal noise, he was just a man who couldn't handle rejection. And by surviving him without bitterness, became his mirror, his punishment, and his peace all at once. So when you see those portraits, Henry standing square, fists on hips, trying to glare the world into submission, remember this: that confidence is armor. Beneath it was fear. Beneath the fear was guilt. And beneath the guilt was a voice whispering, "She didn't love you. She pitied you." That's what haunted him. That's why he lashed out at everyone else. His insecurity wasn't just personal, it became policy. A nation rebuilt in the image of a man who couldn't admit weakness. Let that irony settle in. England tore itself from the Catholic Church, reshaped its laws, executed nobles, and rewrote scripture, all to soothe a single man's fragile ego. And yet, Anne of Cleves, the woman history mocked for being boring, saw it all clearly. She lived through the storm he created and came out the other side unburned. Henry's name is carved into stone. Hers, whispered in quiet corners of Westminster Abbey. But which one truly rests in peace? His waistline expanded as his patience shrank. Truly the Renaissance man of overcompensation. And Anne? She smiled, collected her rents, and let the world believe whatever it wanted. Still watching? Then you know what to do. Stay with me. Because this is where Anne's story stops being just survival and starts becoming something revolutionary. Because after Henry's ego finally buried itself, Anne's quiet legacy began to dig itself free. By now, you've probably noticed something about Tudor England. It wasn't really a monarchy. It was a reality show where every plot twist happened in bed. But make no mistake, the bedroom wasn't just about lust or scandal. It was about power. Every pillow had politics. Every kiss carried a treaty. And every woman who walked into Henry's chamber became a piece on a chessboard made of silk and blood. And Anne of Cleves? She was the one piece that refused to play the game, and that's exactly why she survived it. Let's rewind to the root of the madness. In the Tudor world, a woman's body wasn't hers. It was national currency. Marriages weren't love stories. They were policy documents with fancy embroidery. Kings didn't marry women. They acquired alliances. A wedding ring was just a gilded peace treaty, and passion was an unfortunate side effect. That's what Anne's marriage really was. A political transaction between England and Germany. a Protestant alliance against the looming Catholic powers of Europe. To Henry, Anne wasn't a person. She was a diplomatic insurance policy in a fancy headpiece. But here's where it gets darkly funny. For all his political maneuvering, Henry somehow forgot that alliances require maintenance. When he annulled the marriage, he didn't just dump a wife. He insulted a foreign duke, destabilized trade agreements, and almost reignited a war. All because his ego couldn't handle the fact that a woman didn't find his ulcerated leg charming. It's almost poetic, really. A man who changed the religion of an entire country over one woman's refusal, now doing the same over another's indifference. But Anne didn't protest. She didn't play victim. She didn't even play queen. She simply walked out of the royal bedchamber, looked at the political disaster unraveling behind her, and said, essentially, "That sounds like a you problem." That calm detachment was her genius. In an era where women were either saints, sinners, or scapegoats, and became something new, a survivor with boundaries. Let's pause for a second. Think about that. The woman who was supposed to seal an international alliance ends up teaching an entire court that dignity can be more powerful than desire. She didn't seduce kings or plot revolutions. She just refused to fall apart when her worth was measured by the whims of men. That's not passivity. That's strategy. Because what Henry and his council never understood was this. Anne's supposed failure, her lack of passion, her lack of drama, was her rebellion. Every woman before her had been forced into one extreme or another. Catherine of Aragon was the saintly martyr, Anne Boleyn the villainous temptress, Jane Seymour the tragic angel, Catherine Howard the doomed youth. But Anne of Cleves? She was none of them. She was boring. And in Henry's England, boring was the most radical thing a woman could be. You see, in a world where male power was sustained by spectacle, coronations, executions, public humiliation, Anne's refusal to provide spectacle was revolutionary. She denied him the narrative. She refused to be his cautionary tale. Her annulment hearings, for example, could have been theatrical. She could have fought, cried, accused him. Instead, she sat quietly, nodded, and let the council unravel in confusion. It's hard to destroy someone who doesn't resist your story, because their calm forces you to look at your cruelty in real time. That's the political genius of Anne of Cleves. She didn't win through confrontation. She won through containment. While everyone else was trying to survive Henry's storms, she became the eye of it. Still, calm, unbothered. The entire system ran on drama and refused to feed it. But her story also exposes something deeper. How women's lives were negotiated in rooms they weren't even allowed to enter. Their faces painted, their names traded, their futures decided over parchment and wine. And was both a victim of that system and the quiet glitch that proved it was absurd. Think about the irony. The most stable period of Henry's reign came right after Anne's annulment, when the German alliance, by sheer inertia, still held. She had done her job politically even after being rejected personally. Henry got his peace, England got its alliance, and Anne got her freedom. Everyone won except, of course, the patriarchy's sense of order. That's why men like Cromwell had to die. He was executed officially for treason, but really for reminding Henry that the mess was his own making. Cromwell was the architect who built the bridge, only to watch the king blow it up and blame the builder. And there's Anne again, sitting safely across the river, waving politely. You almost want to imagine her years later, reflecting on it all, the marriage, the politics, the chaos. Maybe she's sitting by the fire, sipping her favorite German wine, smirking as someone tells her the latest court scandal. She's thinking, it's always the same. Men make messes. Women clean them up. Then they call it history. Let that settle for a moment, because that line could sum up half of human civilization. And story is not just about personal endurance. It's about the hidden cost of politics when the powerful confuse ego for destiny. It's about the millions of silent compromises made by women who understood the game better than the men who thought they were running it. She understood the assignment, survived the system without becoming it. And while Henry's other wives became martyrs, myths, and memories, and became something better, a person, a woman who learned that peace isn't given by kings. It's built quietly in the aftermath of their tantrums. Her choice to walk away, to live, to thrive, was the political act no one expected. In a world where every royal marriage was a power grab disguised as love, Anne's decision to value herself outside the throne was a revolution. Quiet, feminine, and utterly unstoppable. So yes, the politics of the bedroom defined her fate, but her reaction to it redefined what it meant to win. Because Anne's quiet defiance made her the prototype for something radical, a woman who chose peace over spectacle. There's something strangely satisfying about seeing the so-called loser of a story end up being the only one who walks away smiling. That's Anne of Cleves, history's misfit queen. The woman who entered Henry's royal circus, refused to dance for the crowd, and left the tent richer, freer, and unscathed. By the 1550s, Anne was no longer just a former queen. She was a living paradox. Everyone had a label for her: the ugly one, the German one, the lucky one. But no one could quite explain how she kept winning in a world where survival was a miracle. She had done the unthinkable. She'd become irrelevant on purpose. Picture her at Hever or Richmond, sitting by a window with her embroidery, dogs at her feet, and a book balanced on her knee. Outside, England keeps spinning. Wars, politics, executions, sermons. But inside her estate, time seems to move slower, like even the air has learned to whisper instead of shout. The courtiers who once mocked her are dead or forgotten. The men who laughed at her accent or her clothes are now footnotes. And Anne? She's sipping imported wine and collecting rent from their descendants. That's not just survival, that's poetic justice. Let's pause for a breath. Imagine the peace of that moment. No crown, no obligations, no husband planning your downfall between banquets. Just quiet dignity, hard-earned and softly kept. This is the irony of Anne's life. She won by being the one everyone underestimated. She didn't fight the system head-on. She let it collapse around her. She didn't need to conquer history. She outlived it. In a dynasty obsessed with passion and blood, she became the queen of endurance. Her rebellion wasn't fire and fury. It was stillness. And stillness in Henry's England was power. Compare that to Henry himself. By the time she was hosting small dinners in her countryside estate, he was buried under stone, his legacy eating itself. The man who spent his life chasing control couldn't control how he was remembered. He wanted to be immortal, he got memes. Meanwhile, Anne, the supposed failure, became the quiet standard of grace. When the courtiers talked about her years later, they didn't mention her looks. They mentioned her kindness, her humor, her ability to laugh gently at life's cruelty. That's what she left behind. Not scandal, not tragedy, stability. It's almost spiritual, the way her story flips the script. For centuries, we've been taught that history belongs to the conquerors, the loud ones, the beautiful ones. But Anne reminds us that sometimes, history belongs to those who simply refuse to die angry. Because what's more rebellious than peace in a world built on chaos? Let's zoom out for a second. The Tudor era wasn't kind to women. Every wife, daughter, or mistress lived at the mercy of one man's insecurities. To survive, you either played the game or disappeared. And did neither. She stood politely in the doorway and said, "Actually, I'll see myself out." That's genius. And it's why modern audiences are falling in love with her story all over again. She feels timeless, the woman who knew when to walk away, the one who didn't need validation to know her worth. She's not a tragedy to pity. She's a mirror for anyone who's ever been underestimated and still thrived. In a way, she's the blueprint for every quiet revolutionary who came after. She didn't shout for freedom. She lived it. She didn't demand power. She embodied self-possession. She didn't rewrite history, she just refused to be erased from it. And the more you look at her life, the more it feels familiar. Haven't we all been, and at some point, misread, misjudged, told we weren't enough or weren't the type, told to stay in the background, only to realize the background is the safest place to build your own kingdom. That's why her story hits different. It isn't glamorous, but it's deeply human. There's a quiet joy in watching her age gracefully while her former husband's empire burns itself out. There's comfort in the thought that goodness, real, steady, boring goodness, might actually win in the long run. And maybe that's the true victory of and of Cleves. She didn't just outlive the other wives. She outgrew the need to compete with them. She didn't need Henry's approval or history's applause, or the world's obsession with beauty. She just needed her garden, her dogs, her books, and the peace she'd earned through restraint. We romanticize rebellion as loud and explosive, the sound of chains breaking, the fire of revolution. But Anne's rebellion was quiet, domestic, graceful. A rebellion that sounded like laughter instead of swords, like a door closing softly instead of slamming shut. When she died, there were no riots, no controversies, no accusations. Just the soft echo of her life continuing through the people who admired her. And that's a kind of immortality Henry never achieved. Because power fades, beauty fades, but peace lingers. And if Cleves never wore a crown for long, but she did something rarer. She wore peace like armor, and it fit better than gold ever could. She didn't need a throne to rule. She just needed the freedom to breathe. So when you think of the Tudors, don't picture the blood or the scandal or the noise. Picture Anne, sitting in her quiet house, smiling to herself, a misfit in history who somehow won everything that mattered. Because sometimes, history hides its winners behind the word boring. Let's talk about that word, ugly. The label that haunted Anne of Cleves longer than any crown ever could. It's the most persistent piece of propaganda in Tudor history, and it tells us more about power, insecurity, and male ego than it ever did about her face. See, when Henry VIII called Anne ugly, the world believed him, because that's what happens when a king throws shade. For centuries, the story stuck, and was plain, disappointing, a diplomatic blunder with good posture. But let's dig into that for a second. We don't actually know what Anne really looked like beyond Holbein's portrait. Every surviving record of her appearance is filtered through gossip, politics, and men who were terrified of Henry's temper. Courtiers described her with phrases like of middling beauty or of no great personage. Translation: she looked like a normal human being in a century obsessed with powdered wigs and divine cheekbones. And that's the point. And so-called plainness wasn't a crime against aesthetics. It was a crime against male fantasy. Henry was used to women who either dazzled him or died trying. Catherine of Aragon was regal, and Boleyn was fiery, Jane Seymour was saintly, and Catherine Howard was flirtatious. Anne of Cleves was polite, steady, practical. She didn't coo over his songs or flatter his politics. She didn't mistake his power for charisma. In short, she didn't play the part. And for a man like Henry, whose self-worth was built on being desired, that neutrality was devastating. So he rewrote the narrative. He couldn't admit he'd fallen out of love with the idea of himself, so he decided the woman in front of him must be ugly. It's not that he couldn't perform. It's that she didn't inspire him. It's not that his pride was fragile. It's that her face was wrong. That's how patriarchy works. When men in power fail, they rename their failures as women's flaws. Let's pause for a second and imagine and hearing that word echo through the court. Ugly, the insult whispered in candlelit corridors, written in ambassadorial letters, spread like perfume gone sour. She probably smiled politely and went back to her embroidery, because what else could she do? And yet, history owes her an apology. Because the evidence we do have suggests and was, in fact, striking. Her complexion was clear, her eyes were soft and intelligent, her figure described as tall and queenly. Even Henry's closest advisor, Thomas Cromwell, called her one of the gentlest ladies in Christendom. Hardly the monster the gossip mill invented. But the myth persisted because ugly women make better cautionary tales. They're easier to laugh at, easier to blame, easier to forget. There's an uncomfortable truth here. The story of Anne's ugliness has survived longer than the truth of her kindness, wit, or intelligence. Even modern textbooks still parrot the same caricature, that she was unattractive, dull, lucky to survive. And yet, what could be more attractive than the only woman who outsmarted a tyrant without drawing a sword? We've seen this pattern before, haven't we? The world loves to downgrade women who don't perform. Cleopatra was called manipulative, Marie Antoinette, frivolous, Anne of Cleves, plain. Every label a way to control the narrative. Every insult a way to hide a truth too inconvenient to admit. Because the truth is and wasn't plain. She was peaceful. And peace doesn't photograph well in a world addicted to chaos. Think about the propaganda machine that powered Henry's reign. Portraits, sermons, letters, all designed to glorify him. Every story that painted and as undesirable conveniently made Henry look like a tragic hero instead of a petty man with a bruised ego. It was political spin before spin doctors were a thing. And like all good PR campaigns, it worked. For centuries, she was remembered as the Flanders mare, a nickname that, fun fact, Henry never actually wrote down himself. It appears in letters decades later, courtesy of gossipy nobles who couldn't resist a cheap laugh. In reality, and was described by those who met her as amiable, gentle, and well-favored. Not drop-dead gorgeous, but not a medieval troll either. So why does the myth still sting? Because it hits a nerve that hasn't gone away. Society still punishes women who don't conform to beauty standards set by men who can't meet their own. We still live in a world where being plain is treated like failure, where worth is measured in desirability rather than peace. Let that sink in. And Story is a 500-year-old reflection of a very modern wound. She wasn't destroyed by beauty, she was erased by expectation. And maybe that's what makes her victory so powerful. She didn't fight to prove she was beautiful. She didn't need to. She redefined what it meant to win without ever picking up the weapons handed to her. When Henry's courtiers called her plain, she built gardens. When they whispered she was dull, she hosted dinners. When history tried to flatten her into a punchline, she quietly became the moral of the story. There's a kind of defiance in that stillness, a calm refusal to let other people's lies define you. It's the kind of strength that doesn't make headlines, but it lasts. Because centuries later, we're still talking about her. Not Henry's lust, not Holbein's paint, but her. The woman who outlasted a king and the myth he built to excuse himself. So the next time someone tells you and of Cleves was the ugly one, remember this. She's the only one who got out alive, rich and content. And if that's what ugly looks like, sign me up. Maybe it's time to stop asking if and was beautiful, and start asking why we cared. If and if Cleves lived today, she'd have 1 million quiet followers on social media, a book deal about emotional boundaries, and a cottagecore TikTok series called Unbothered in Tudor England. She wouldn't shout slogans. She'd sip tea, smile, and let her peace speak louder than protest. But 5 centuries ago, there wasn't a word for what she embodied. They didn't have self-worth, emotional intelligence, or boundaries. They had survival and then turned it into an art form. She didn't call herself a feminist, of course. The word didn't exist yet. But her entire life was a slow, graceful act of rebellion against the script written for women like her. In a world where female virtue was defined by obedience or martyrdom, Anne's quiet defiance was radical. She didn't die for love. She didn't bend for power. She simply lived and lived well. Let's take a closer look at what that really meant. When Henry divorced her, everyone expected tragedy. A woman stripped of her title was supposed to fade away, humiliated and forgotten. Instead, Anne negotiated. She leveraged her position with the calm of someone who understood that surrender could be a strategy. She walked out of the marriage richer than when she entered it, with estates, jewels, and the royal title of king's beloved sister. She turned scandal into stability, divorce court into financial freedom. And that's feminist behavior before feminism had a name. Because she didn't try to destroy the system. She used it. She studied it, understood it, and then quietly rearranged it to suit her peace. No manifestos, no rebellions, no fiery speeches. Just logic, wit, and dignity. She weaponized patience in a world that mistook it for weakness. It's easy to underestimate that kind of power, especially in a century obsessed with drama. But think about what she achieved. Emotional independence in a patriarchal monarchy. Financial security without submission. Respect in a court that mocked her. And above all, survival, a feat every other wife failed to achieve. That's not just luck. That's strategy. And didn't fight Henry. She outgrew him. And in doing so, she gave history something new, the template for a kind of feminine power that doesn't need noise to be strong. Let's pause for a second. Imagine and walking through the halls of her estate in her later years. No crown, no court, no chaos. Just her, a woman who knows exactly who she is. Her servants adore her. Her neighbors respect her. And the royal family keeps her close because, somehow, she's managed to make herself untouchable. It's almost funny, isn't it? The same woman Henry declared unworthy ends up being the only one everyone can trust. She outlived his lies, outlasted his reign, and became a soft echo of sanity in the aftermath of his tyranny. There's this one letter from an ambassador who visited her after Henry's death. He described her as content, wise, and merry. Merry. That word might seem small, but in Tudor England it was revolutionary. It meant joy that wasn't granted by a man, happiness not tied to status. The kind of self-sourced peace the era didn't know how to name. And that's where Anne's feminism shines through. It's not loud, not ideological, but deeply human. She proved that survival itself could be subversive, that a woman could reject victimhood without ever raising her voice. She was, in every sense, the quiet revolution before revolutions had slogans. When we look back on her life now, it's easy to see the modern parallels. Every woman who's ever walked away from a toxic relationship without looking back, and of Cleves is your patron saint. Every person who's ever chosen sanity over spectacle, who's realized that being underestimated is its own kind of shield, that's her legacy. It's no wonder her story's being reclaimed today. For centuries, historians wrote her off as the dull one, the background character in Henry's drama. But the truth is, she was playing a different game entirely. One that didn't need blood or fame or a throne to win. In fact, she might be the only one in the Tudor saga who actually got what everyone else wanted. Control. And here's the real kicker, Henry respected her for it. Oh, he'd never admit it, of course. But the way he treated her after their annulment says everything. He trusted her enough to keep her at court, to let her attend family celebrations, to correspond with her warmly until his death. You don't extend that kind of favor to someone you despise. You do it when you know you've been bested gracefully. So yes, Anne was underestimated, misjudged, erased, but not defeated. She didn't fight for power, she negotiated it. She didn't break barriers. She simply walked around them. She didn't demand freedom. She lived it. There's something timeless in that lesson. Because real power isn't in shouting louder than the system. It's in surviving it, reshaping it, and smiling while it collapses behind you. And didn't want to rule kingdoms. She wanted to rule herself. And that's exactly what she did. Let that sink in. 5 centuries later, her story still hums with quiet defiance. The sound of a woman who refused to be rewritten by men's mistakes. So the next time someone calls her the boring one, remember this. And if Cleves didn't need to change the world, she just had to show it how to live differently. And that's how the Misfit Queen became history's softest rebel. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You've officially survived more royal drama than half the Tudor court. And now we arrive at the quietest, most underrated twist of all. The ending that wasn't tragic, or bloody, or scandalous. The ending that was simply peaceful. And of Cleves, the woman mocked, misjudged, mislabeled, did something that no one else in this 6-act royal soap opera ever managed. She made boring into a form of victory. Think about that. In a dynasty addicted to spectacle, where every wife had to either die dramatically or live desperately, Anne's calm, steady existence was an act of rebellion. No executions. No exile. No betrayals whispered behind fans. Just laughter, gardens, wine, and letters that always ended with, "I thank God for my quiet," because while history rewards chaos, peace never trends. But let's not sugarcoat it. Boring was a death sentence in Tudor PR. You couldn't just be content, you had to be legendary. Kings were supposed to conquer, queens were supposed to suffer, and anyone who lived quietly got edited out of the script. That's why Anne faded from the spotlight. She didn't give the historians a spectacle worth gossiping over. And that's exactly why she deserves one now. Picture her one last time. It's late evening in her Richmond estate. The air smells of lavender and smoke. A servant sets down a candle. The light flickers across the walls that once heard music, laughter, and political plotting, and leans back in her chair, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. She's lived through the rise and ruin of an empire, and all she wants now is silence. Not the silence of fear, the silence of peace. That's the part of her story we rarely tell. Not the scandal, not the annulment, the after, the healing, because life after Henry wasn't exile. It was liberation. While everyone else tried to make sense of his chaos, she slipped out of the narrative, quietly rewriting her own. She became the first Tudor woman to retire on her own terms, financially secure, emotionally unscathed, spiritually whole. The same court that once judged her now respected her. Ambassadors sought her advice. The royal children adored her. Even the public, who had laughed at her awkward English and foreign manners, grew to admire her calm wisdom. The so-called boring queen had become the kingdom's most beloved sister, the safe harbor in a sea of royal insanity. And yet, centuries later, she's still the least discussed wife of Henry VIII. Historians gloss over her because her story lacks blood and tragedy. But maybe that's the whole point. Maybe peace is the plot twist. Because if you zoom out, you'll notice something poetic. Henry's other wives represent the extremes: passion, rebellion, obedience, betrayal, martyrdom, and represents balance. She's the quiet middle, the calm breath between storms. And maybe that's why her story feels so strangely modern. She didn't win by dominating. She won by detaching. In a culture, then and now, that glorifies noise and reminds us that peace is not a flaw. It's not cowardice. It's mastery, the ability to live without constantly performing for approval. To step away from the chaos and say, "I'm done playing." That's the real revolution hiding under all this boring history. You could argue that Anne of Cleves was the first Tudor to actually achieve what everyone else claimed to want: a stable, lasting peace. And she didn't do it through violence, politics, or manipulation. She did it through emotional intelligence, something no sword, crown, or throne could replicate. There's a kind of gentle irony in the fact that we only remember the Tudors for their chaos. The passion, the beheadings, the fireworks. But maybe the only reason we can stand to look at that madness at all is because of people like the ones who balanced the scale. The ones who quietly proved that humanity could exist even inside a royal furnace. So, yeah, maybe her life doesn't read like a Netflix drama. Maybe she never plotted treason, never inspired sonnets, never drove a king mad with desire. But she also never died on a scaffold, never became a scandal, and never had to beg for forgiveness. She simply lived. And that, in the end, is what makes her story unforgettable. It's the paradox of boring history. It's only boring because it ended well. Because if she had screamed, schemed, or lost her head, she'd be a tragedy. But because she laughed, negotiated, and chose peace, she's a miracle. Let that sink in. In a world where every queen was told to die beautifully, Anne of Cleves dared to live plainly. She didn't just survive Henry, she outlasted his myth, and her peace outlasted his kingdom. So the next time someone calls her the dull one, remember, boring is just what they call people who figured it out early. In the noise of history, Anne's calm became its final note, soft, steady, and enduring. Because in the Tudor game of thrones and heartbreak, the loud ones burned, the cruel ones crumbled, and the beautiful ones bled. Only the boring one walked away breathing. And maybe that's not boring at all. If you made it this far, you've survived more royal nonsense than most monarchs did. So do the noble thing. Subscribe, leave your favorite Tudor insult in the comments, and remember, sometimes the quietest person in the room already won the crown.